Okay, I'm all warm and fuzzy. With that, I'm going to transition over to Reggie Ramos, our keynote speaker for this morning. Reggie is the Executive Director of Transportation for Massachusetts, or T4MA, a coalition of community-based and nonprofit organizations advocating for just and equitable transportation across the Commonwealth. Prior to joining T4MA in 2023, Reggie served in roles at the MBTA, the Institute for Human-Centered Design, where she was a lead negotiator at the Paris Agreement at COP21 and was the Undersecretary of Transportation for the Republic of the Philippines. I hope you will take a moment to review her bio in the program materials to learn more about her accomplishments and her incredible leadership. We at MPHA are so proud to call her an ally. Now, without further delay, Reggie Ramos.
Thanks, Omi. Good morning, everybody. I'm just waiting for my slides to come up, but I would like to thank, first of all, the Massachusetts Public Health Alliance for inviting me. It is a privilege to speak to all of you today on a very timely topic, power, and how understanding it can lead to effective change-making. What is power? At the outset, a disclaimer. I am not an academic, so my understanding and theories of power may fall short of scholarly standards. While I may subscribe to theories of power proffered by academics, I draw my own conclusions of power from my own life and professional experiences as an advocate, public servant, immigrant, and as a human being who believes in our collective right to freedom and prosperity. I grew up in the Global South, and there, power presents itself in the most unambiguous fashion. It is impossible to miss. I was born at the time when martial law had been imposed, supposedly to guarantee the security of citizens against communism and rebellious tendencies. Martial law meant that Ferdinand Marcos then controlled all functions and decisions of government with hardly any limits. Based on records, his dictatorship resulted in 70,000 incarcerations, more than 3,000 extrajudicial killings, 35,000 documented tortures, and hundreds disappeared. On an everyday level, being under a dictatorship effectively meant the suspension of civil liberties. There was a curfew. There was heavy police and military presence, frequent random checkpoints. Freedom of speech was heavily censored, and any form of political assembly faced serious consequences. We had martial law for 10 years, and we were under a dictatorship for double that. I guess one could say that as a child, I learned the limits of freedom first, before I learned its full breadth. In 1991, I was about 12 years old. My teacher brought me and a few of her students to our first immersion, which turned out to be our first actual protest. In hindsight, I don't know why she did that, because if a teacher did that today, they would be in a whole lot of trouble. But anyway, no regrets. I was always curious as a kid and would watch the evening news religiously with my dad. So in my preteen age mind, I had a sense of what was going on. I don't remember exactly the actual precursors, but what is burnt into memory is that I found myself in the midst of a huge crowd. They were also energized, or should I say, we were also energized, protesting against state-sanctioned foreign military presence. Before I knew it, I found myself perched on top of a minibus, or what we call jeepneys, speaking truth to power onto a megaphone, which was then blasted all over AM radio. Much to the consternation and panic of my poor parents, who heard a familiar little voice on their car radio and realizing it was me. On that day, I learned the wrath of my parents, naturally, and that that power resides even in little voices. They say that one doesn't really know power until one loses it. In 2016, I left government after having served as Undersecretary of Transportation of the Republic of the Philippines and its lead climate negotiator at COP21, which gave us all the Paris Agreement. That year, the Philippines became the stage for the global resurgence of populist leaders, and Duterte, Rodrigo Duterte, a self-acknowledged murderer, was elected president. He launched a massive bloody war on drugs, clearly as a distraction of what soon became a revival of all things despotic. Being in the opposition was perilous, and anyone who challenged authority was made to pay. In my view, we were all made to pay in one way or another. As a former official serving under a previous administration, the writing on the wall was clear. Upon the arrest of a staunch opposition senator and a former colleague on false charges. At that point, for me, everything tuned out like static on television, and there was nothing but silence. Through this, I learned that once you are relegated to the sidelines, you learn to be invisible, and soon enough, you are. Unfettered power is meant to deplete you, rendering you unable to oppose and without energy to resist. It is not enough to recognize power when it's exercised by others on you. To be able to move, excuse me, to be able to move with power and move in power, it is crucial to know its essence. Julie Batelana gives, I believe, the most accessible and tangible definition of power. Power is the ability to influence behavior of other people by persuasion or coercion. You have power when you have control over access to resources valued by other people. From this, one gets a sense that power can be relative and is relational. Power is dynamic, and the flow of power can change over time. Power can be negotiated depending on the set of actors and how they figure in the arena. In a broader scale, for example, in as much as government officials have the authority and power to enact and implement policy, people have the power to bestow elected officials their mandate or strip them of their position, which can mean depleting their power or curtailing their influence. Because power has been so entrenched in certain classes of people for many years, it is naive to think that power resting in legacy structures can be overturned at will or at once. Whether an advocate or policymaker, the consciousness of what resources you and what is vital to your counterpart allows you to map where you are in the power landscape. And to me, having that knowledge is already power itself. As an advocate, I posit that we are better served when we can locate ourselves in the power landscape and are able to leverage our own positionality. This means knowing what people need and want, who controls access to those needs and wants, and finding a path that results in their equitable distribution. One of the many features of patriarchal structures is that the power differential is stark and steep. And this is by design so that those with less power remain subservient to those who have more, and those who have more retain their stature. Those in the middle are given just enough to realize the precarity, enough to foment apathy, which in turn further widens societal gaps. While we know this, it is not uncommon to overlook how infrastructure has been employed to maintain legacy power structures and exclusive policies. For example, in the 1920s, Robert Moses, touted as America's greatest builder, bulldozed Black and Hispanic homes in New York for him to build parks. And when he built the highways from the city to the beaches of Long Island, he ordered engineers to make sure those bridges were low enough so that city buses, which would likely carry poor people, would not be able to pass through. Here in Massachusetts, we continue to live with some of the consequences of this sort of mindset, turned into policy and turned into people's realities. By overlaying, let me go back one slide. All right. By overlaying the map of the MBTA, rapid transit lines with a map of the racial composition of Boston, one will see an unmistakable avoidance of communities of color by the obvious absence of rapid transit options in Roxbury, Mattapan, and Chelsea. This is not simply about transportation. What it is the uneven and disproportionate capabilities of movement and the unequal rights to stay or remain in a certain place. By default, excuse me, we often rely on democratic processes to safeguard society from abuses of power or oppression. When institutions are mature, they can be quite resistant to manipulation and are able to secure the will of the people. But it is often more complicated than that. Throughout time, the limits of democratic institutions have been repeatedly tested. Today, however, democratic processes are routinely disrupted by algorithms, disinformation, and fake news, making it challenging for all political actors to recognize real issues, dividing people from the time they pick up their phones because each one is fed a customized narrative. Today, facts are filtered through lenses that remove their objectivity and truthfulness. Talking about widespread misinformation, Nobel laureate Maria Ressa opined that without facts, there is no truth. With no truth, there is no trust. Without trust, we have no shared reality, no democracy. There is much to be said about the interest embedded in democratic processes we have created. For now, I want to focus on outcomes and how to change them. It is self-defeating to think that power is constant. One of the variables of democracy is that its outcomes are subject to change. And precisely because of this, that literally anything can be changed, this is the reason why we adhere to the process and hope that we can overturn outcomes that no longer reflect collective values. Elections as a democratic process confer authority to winners. And because we hold sacred the process, we submit to the outcome and somehow trust or hope that it embodies the wisdom of the people. Until it does not, what then? Well, we examine the status quo and expose its inequities. Today, about 60% of the world is living under some autocratic rule. In a scan of the world, Freedom House this year concluded that we are on our 18th consecutive year of decline in global freedom. In 2023, 53 countries experienced democratic downturns. The study attributes the decline to diminished political rights and civil liberties, flawed elections, armed conflict, endangering freedom, and causing human suffering. Of note, the study states that the rejection of pluralism, the peaceful coexistence of people with different political ideas, religions, or ethnic identities by authoritarian leaders and armed groups produced repression, violence, and a steep decline in overall freedom. In 2022, a similar study showed that even established democracies experienced notable decline. The 2020 presidential elections and the incidents of January 6, 2021 caused the US to fall behind its peers on key democratic indicators, including executive elections, freedom from improper political influence, and equal treatment of minority groups. It is not lost on me that in terms of rise of intimidation and violence, the US ranks alongside the Philippines. I can confirm that this is not good. If anything, these studies exhibit the fragility of democratic processes and how they are subject to the temperaments of the powerful. When we understand both the concepts of power and the status quo, we are positioned to unravel why inequities are entrenched, and we are best poised to change them. When the status quo is unacceptable, we hold power to account. We do not hold power to account only when things go wrong. I submit that from the get-go, we must hold power to account. This means that when we put people in places of power, we demand from them transparency and accountability in all aspects, morally, socially, environmentally, and fiscally. And we are best served when we do this by consolidating our power through coalitions and alliances. To overturn legacy power holders or upend entrenched structural dysmorphia, we need to build and rely on our own power base. Even little voices have power, yes, but in unison with others, it becomes a force. We organize so that we can collectively convert our diverse individual resources into power needed to effect change. Organizing is the infrastructure you build so you can check on power. It has been 2 years since my organization, T4MA, a coalition, emerged from restructuring and decided to expand its membership beyond the typical characteristics of organizations having some transportation focus. An intentional pivot to center underserved, low-income Black and Brown communities of color demanded a coalition membership that work on a swath of other social justice work streams: environmental justice, climate, food security, public health, housing, human health and social services, and others. All of us understanding how transportation underpins our social and collective quality of life. And in this diversity, this is, I believe, where we draw our power. As we harness our differences in pursuit of our common values, we gain agility to negotiate with power, and we win because of the breadth of impact we showcase. The coalition model works based on mutual trust and shared commitment to empower the collective. Multi-sectoral collaboration is key for any collective movement, and by its very nature, it challenges singularity and superiority. Coalitions and alliances thrive because they democratize power. The existence of any multi-sectoral coalition switches up the constellation of actors and poses an existential threat to legacy power holders. With a diverse, agile constellation, you upend their belief that they are the center of the universe, and instead, you make way for new stars or beacons of light. Perhaps the most recent example of the power of collective action is the successful passage of the MBTA low-income fares. This program gives income-eligible riders a 50% discount on all modes operated by the MBTA. This game-changing program was a direct result of nearly a decade of advocacy by a wide swath of stakeholders: labor, seniors, low-income folks, brown and Black folks, communities of color, people with disabilities, academia, business sector, in tandem with champions from within the authority. This is a good example of strategizing coming into full action. Advocates used what they had, their voices, research, and data, to get them what they needed: entry and access and leverage in the decision-making process, to get them what they wanted: policy and funding that support the implementation of income-based reduced fares. I want to pause here and acknowledge the precarity of the moment and how we are faced with a change in power, challenging the resilience of institutions and processes we hold sacred. We've talked about building a powerful constituency, consolidating and power, and now let's focus on turning it into action. Democracy is something you actively work on, and the rights of speech, assembly, and expression serve as potent tools to oppose oppression. Beginning in December 1955, members of the Montgomery Improvement Association and residents of Montgomery, Alabama, used the sheer force of their feet to confront power by staging a 13th-month mass protest that culminated with the US Supreme Court ruling the segregation on public buses unconstitutional. As a transport person, I am compelled to point out the centrality of streets in hosting this full display of power, this full display of people power. Today, transportation continues to host difficult conversations and continues to be a stage for movements. In 2020, we saw the centrality of public spaces in our lives. The pandemic saw us closing many public spaces. COVID caused so much dislocation and loss that when the country was confronted with racial reckoning, we needed to access the streets again. While we saw vibrant discussions online, we all craved for the traction and connection that only streets could give. More to the point, in the streets, we become tangibly part of a movement. We witness the physicality of a common cause, and we are seen in all our vulnerabilities and in all our power, in community with others who feel and believe the same. Just a few weeks ago, South Korean President Yoon declared martial law. Let me just fix the slides. Okay, the slide should have come up a while ago, but here we are. Just a few weeks ago, South Korean President Yoon declared martial law, supposedly to eliminate anti-state forces. This meant sending the military to the streets to maintain order. Only the National Assembly can reverse the declaration of martial law by a majority vote. South Korea wasted no time. South Korea has had its share of military-backed dictatorship in the past. Last week, the people of Seoul showed us what it took. They proceeded to the streets, to their National Assembly, where they were met with military forces, physically preventing the National Assembly from convening. There were reports of lawmakers literally climbing their way into the assembly building. But this act of defiance by oppositionist An Guiryong, by pushing away a gun pointed at her, embodied the people power activated at that time. By early morning the next day, martial law was overturned. I've talked about the need for organizing, for the consolidation of power from a broad constituency. I turn now to what makes an effective change maker. Effective change makers are people who have turned their resources, their voice, and their connections into power, and are those who have earned people's trust. The book People for All tells us that effective change makers are those who are, one, well-connected, and those whom we go for advice. For the most part, I believe that we gain connection through our constant exposure with stakeholders and constituency. And over time, relationships are built. But building trust, okay, let me go back to the slides. I'm going to take you to the right slides. But building trust takes more time. And deepening that trust takes more than time. It requires the deepening of relationships and calls us, advocates and policymakers alike, to dig deep into our humanity, to connect with other people, and to find our binding similarities over our differences. Knowing people's stories, getting to the root of your constituency's causes allows us to identify the reasons behind their causes, blurring the difference between individuals, paving the way for the creation of a collective movement rooted in people. In my view, one of the most critical elements of radical change making is that it is rooted in the person, their lived experience, their collective liberation and prosperity of the people, and the centrality of all that. We have seen many policies like the federal highway system. They have failed us and divided us because they were rooted in selective prosperity premised on the oppression of others. Policy that centers people's lived experience aimed at collective liberation and prosperity institutionalizes people power. When we center lived experience in our policy, we not only address the practical needs at a most profound level, we also elevate the power residing in people and their agency to change things. This model of change making centers the sharing of power and mitigates the chronic concentration of power. Let me take you to the last slide. The work of power shifting and change making is hard and long. And today, with the backsliding of democracy, tangible loss of freedom, rise of populism, disinformation, and fear mongering rhetoric, that work is even made more complex. I feel that I would be extremely remiss as I talk about power without addressing the changes we are all to face in the next coming weeks. There is no shying away from it, and we must meet the moment. And I say that we meet the moment with radical love. All of us here today, all with our own agency and power, we must meet the moment with radical love. It is so easy to scoff at seemingly illogical choices, but this behavior is precisely what feeds the polarization, making everyone susceptible to fear-based narratives. Populist and authoritarian rhetoric is designed to appeal the basal need for safety. As such, portraying any opposition as a threat to security becomes a potent tool in cementing authoritarian tendencies. We need to fully understand that angry rhetoric highlights our differences to prevent us from coming together. This way of speaking to each other triggers us to build our own echo chambers, fueling our mutual distrust and perpetuating a mutual disgust, even at the point of contact. This system teaches us to fear each other, and this is what we must change. We must address this feeling of fear because, as Gans tells us, how we feel sets the agenda of how we use what we know. From Nietzsche's radical affirmation to bell hooks to the Turkish opposition strategies, radical love is a way to conquer this fear. We live in a world with fleeting moments that destabilizes our sense of safety, leaving us feelings of uncertainty and fear, which are then exploited to perpetuate power. To counter this, we must organize love, because simply put, love addresses fear in its most basic sense. To love and demand love is a revolutionary action that upends our current state of fear. In the words of bell hooks, the moment we choose to love, we begin to move against domination, against oppression. The moment we choose to love, we begin to move towards freedom, to act in ways that liberate ourselves and others. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Reggie, for that insightful presentation. And hello, everybody. My name is Alexis Walls, and I am MPHA's campaign director. And I'm really fortunate that I get to work with Reggie through our transportation justice work at the Mass Public Health Association. And I'm actually going to be helping with this Q&A. And so if you have not already, please don't forget to put questions in the Q&A box that we might be able to ask Reggie, and we will ask her as many as we can get to within the next few minutes. But Reggie, it looks like we do have a question that someone has asked. Andrea Freeman says, years ago, I learned that power in the nonprofit advocacy world requires organized people or organized money. Do you think this is an accurate or helpful description?
I think it's accurate. It's also very realistic. I think that we've operated in silos for a long time, not being able to recognize how to leverage power. Power comes in many forms. And realistically, in the world we live in, uh, some of the mobilizing needs to be funded, right? The question is, where does that, in terms of our morals, where does that money come from and to what end? And how do we use that to further common interest? I think that the challenge isn't really one is to bring all these sort of resources that I speak of about into one arena, but also to direct that for the common good. I think that's a constant challenge that we all in this room continue to face every day.
Thanks, Reggie. And towards the end of your presentation, you talked about this idea of radical love holding a lot of power. Somebody in the audience asked, can you provide an example or two for what you have seen of applied radical love?
So Turkey, for all we know, it has a very tumultuous political sort of arena. And recently they launched what they call, what opposition is called, is like a movement for radical love to upend sort of this long-standing president in power, and they've gained traction about it. And the whole idea is we live in this world where leaders or wannabe leaders want to appeal to our basic sense of security. And so everything is spoken of with a language of fear. And the theory is to confront that with love, not with dismissal. I think that, social media, for instance, and that's spoken of in the Turkish example, for instance, the social media has weaponized sort of rhetoric, right, in the spread of information to get at this basic feeling or basic human reaction of fear. And I think that in its most basic sense, how do you conquer fear? And what is the feeling? What is that emotion that wraps and overcomes fear? And I think that's really love. That's really only love. And in the feminist movement, when you speak of love, it's often dismissed. You are often dismissed because it's in the sidelines. But the truth is, our actions come from a deeper place of emotion. When we access our own emotional resources into the movement, it becomes powerful because it becomes personal, because the cause becomes personal. There are many examples of radical love, but I think that one really resonates at this place and time. Whether it's successful or not, there are different scales of success. I think the Turkish example really caused worldwide attention because it really appended sort of this wave of support onto a president that has been there for decades. But I think it's also, we are called to examine under the theory of radical love, let's call it that. We are called to examine how we see ourselves and how we interact with our fellow human beings. And we're called to, like, how do we conduct ourselves in the political arena that's so much bombarded by fear and extreme and debasing language.
Thanks, Reggie. And I think your response there, especially what you said about radical love making things personal, is something that also answers a question that somebody else had in the chat, which is, how does radical love provide the energy needed to maintain the attention and work necessary to organize? So thank you for that response. Another question that someone asked is, as a democratic country that is losing freedom, it's easy to believe those driving freedom change in the right direction can be missing the mark and further leading to loss of freedom. How do we find balance in our agreed values when we all don't agree on our values? Groupthink can occur and it can miss the mark. What are your thoughts?
Oh my God, there's a lot of there's a lot to unpack there, but let me tell you this from experience.
Sure.
The accretion of freedom and rights, the erosion of that happens very slowly. And having lived in under two dictatorships, I know that for sure. The allure of power and I will get down to business, I will take, charge of everything, really resides in a place where it allows for this slow erosion of our rights. And if we're not vigilant enough, one day we wake up, it's gone. The very essence of democracy is shared values. And by shared values it also means that it isn't always that we share values. It is, the very essence of democracy is that it's dynamic, that it changes, and values change because constituencies change, right? And I think that when we're speaking of differences in values, this is where dialogue comes in and becomes a vital piece to that. How do we talk about our values, or how do we talk through values that preserves our humanity? And I really wanted to focus on how we talk to each other, because I think this seems to be a huge problem. I know Alexis and I have had private conversations about this, about reaching out to folks we don't usually reach out to because of differences in views. But I think now is the time to kind of reject these silos, these echo chambers, and go out of our comfort zones to examine if our values indeed are as important as what we think of them, and examine the collective want and need to come up with a collective value, like a common value. And I think there's a lot to be said about, people coming together. But I think at the end of the day, I think as an advocate, part of our job is to provide that space for that dialogue, to host that dialogue, and making sure that dialogue that happens. Because when there is no space for that dialogue, that's really when democracy is gone.
Thanks, Reggie. One of the things that you talked a lot about is just this idea of power residing in little voices, and then those little voices becoming bigger and bigger and more amplified as people come together and organize together. And as you know, as has been talked about at the beginning of this conference, MPHA recently changed our name to better reflect our value and partnership, because we do everything in coalition, just as we know that T for Mass does. And trustworthiness is one of our commitments as an organization, as the Mass Public Health Alliance. But how do we go about building trust? And can it be done quickly and in moments of urgency, like many feel at various different points in our political process? How do we build partnership, or how do we build trust? And can it be done quickly in moments of urgency?
One thing's for sure, we cannot build trust out of extractive relationships. So I think that we have come across as an advocate, have come across many attempts at leveraging on community voices and short-cutting processes just to be able to say that they have talked to community voices. And that's not the way to go. That's not how you build trust. That is the opposite. That's how you build distrust. And I think that when we're talking about, talk about trust and moving in the speed of trust, I think I look at alliances and coalition as compounded relationships, as a network that lights up because of one connection to the other. But that constellation only works when one relationship is meaningful as it connects to the other. I think that in my work as, in transportation, I connect with housing because both of our sectors see the importance of each other. But underneath that, we also then connect with public health because we see that as an underpinning human condition. And when that is premised on a common cause that you sort of map out and stare out into in my case, my daytime dreams or reveries, you really build this cumulative effect of multiple deep and meaningful relationships. This is not to say that, of course, there will be relationships that are meant to last only a certain period of time, and that's what That's the service they do to the movement. But overall, I would say that building one-on-one relationships and, grassroots activation and organizing, this really and creating that sort of cascading cumulative of effect of creating more networks and more relationships redound to what I think are effective coalitions.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Reggie. And I'm just know that time we are limited on, and so I think that is the last question that I will ask you. But I just want everybody to just join me one more time in thanking Reggie for her vision and dedication. And thank you, Reggie, for sharing such a powerful message with us that really draws upon your personal experience professionally, as well as just personally in the different political contexts that you've lived in, and how you've been able to sort of organize in all of those spaces. So thank you so much, Reggie.